about how to teach the Irish language properly. Somebody who was, for instance, consulted by An Tathair Peadar Ó Léire, himself a master of prose style, a new prose style in the Irish language. But he consulted regularly with An Tathair Gearóid Ó Nuallainn about his own usage of Irish. So there is something of the pedant, if you like, almost in the genetic composition of the O'Nuallainn family, and certainly that's part of the attraction of much of Brian O'Nuallainn's own work as Miles na Gcopaleen or Flann O'Brien, a kind of manic pedantry. But his relationship with Irish goes back to his formative years, where, because of his strong nationalist convictions, his father insisted on keeping the children home from school so that they would not be contaminated by the English language if they were sent to school in Strabane and later on in Dublin, with the result that effectively they were self-educated until Brian first went to school at the age of 11, and the father undertook to educate them himself. He was away with his work much of the time and would send home reading lists occasionally for the boys. So their encounter with both languages, actually, with both English and Irish, is very peculiar. We have Brian and his brother Ciarán's word for it, that they read voraciously from their father's quite extensive library, which had an abundance of material both in Irish and the kind of staple, if you like, of popular, romantic and detective fiction from that period. So there's a lovely phrase about Miles. I can't quite remember. Is it Wise Jackson who says it? That in looking at his early work, there's a sense of perhaps of someone who has perhaps opened one too many books at too tender an age, and I think that's absolutely spot on. That his understanding of language is a very bookish understanding. He derives his understanding both of Irish and of English from his contact with both those languages in libraries, in his father's private library and elsewhere. And language, therefore, is somehow it's kind of one step off the ground of reality, if you like. And this is often commented upon to explain his peculiar relationship to the English language. Anthony Cronin, amongst others, has said he writes English as if it were a dead language. I think it's interesting also that his Irish is peculiar. It is the intimate domestic language of his childhood, but he would have discovered, as many urban speakers of Irish discover when he went to the Gaeltacht for the first time, that the language in which he had invested himself, if you like, as a young boy, was very different and in many ways disconnected from Irish as a vernacular spoken language amongst a community of native speakers. And I think that ultimately explains his uncertainty, his scepticism about all languages. There is no place to which he can retreat. He can't retreat from English into the Irish language because he discovers that his own grasp of Irish is eccentric, peculiar and unreliable.
Louis Dupuer there. Jenny Baines, what do you make of that? I was very struck by Louis' description of the manic pedantry of O'Brien. It's a fine phrase.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. What was very interesting to me too was how he was really talking about these ideas of how Flann O'Brien, Brian O'Nuallainn, Brian O'Nolan would have defined himself based on this language, and how these definitions were in constant flux. I mean, you never quite knew where you stood with him with language, because you're at home and you're speaking one kind of language, and not only does this language is this language the language of your family, but it also defines in many ways the political viewpoint of the family, and then you go somewhere else and they speak a different kind of Irish. And I think it would have been difficult for him too, or at least it's very interesting to think about how he would have conceived of language based on what he read. And so this idea of being pedantic is I think in a way searching for some sort of concrete, reliable way of seeing what language is, where I stand in relation to it, who am I in relation to this language, and what language am I speaking at this particular time.
Carol, of course, the other language that Flann O'Brien had to engage in and with was, if you like, the officialese of the state and as a civil servant. Do you think that his role as civil servant for so long in some way restricted his artistic voice, and did it push him and make him push the limits of what he could do to make that more surreal world in order in a way to satirise what he was at the centre of?
Well, I guess it restricted him in various obvious ways. You know, he couldn't swim in political waters. He couldn't comment on some of the, no doubt, shocking things that he saw going around him at the time. And sometimes you get that sense of frustration in the columns, that irritation with the dead languages, the bureaucracies, even if he is a bit of a manic pedant himself. And perhaps that contributes to the decline of it, perhaps in the 50s and the 60s, you know, that he starts to mount a soapbox a bit and he starts to mouth off about stupidly insignificant things like CIE timetables and, you know, why isn't the country being run properly? Like someone heckling from the back of a civil service office, you know, why isn't things running on time? When you feel perhaps someone with his satirical insight should be taking things to task in a bit stronger fashion, but he couldn't. It was the nature of his position, I suppose.
Keith Hopper, you mentioned Eastern Europe there, and I suppose somebody again who comes to mind in relation to Flann O'Brien is Kafka.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And I think that experience with the civil service fed into the novels. You know, you get the feeling that he uses personas in a very strong way, a very intelligent way. It's not just to protect his identity, I think, in the civil service. I think he creates, you know, complete personas. I think there is a difference between, say, Miles and Flann. Miles is a kind of know-all figure. There's the charming begrudger side of him. But Flann O'Brien's different. I think his novels are written from the point of view of a quite damaged, even insane narrator, and the voice is much darker in texture and tone. So I think it allows him to play with some different aspects of his own life that he probably found very grim. And I sometimes wonder if, you know, it's been said that, you know, when he woke up in the morning after a night of drinking and writing, if Brian O'Nolan was disturbed by some of the things that Miles or Flann had written using these different masks.
It sounds like a plot for one of his own novels.
Absolutely. His life was a plot from one of his own novels, yeah.
As you know, Keith, I mean, the Blue Raincoat Theatre Company in Sligo with Jocelyn Clarke have adapted several of the novels for stage, and very successfully so. And I've always felt there's a great theatrical impulse in a good deal of the work. And, of course, he tried his hand not so successfully at theatre.
Well, that's true of Joyce too, isn't it? You know, I mean, I think he's got a great ear for pub conversation, and he plays that well, but he doesn't have the sense of dramatic structure that would work in plays. I mean, he has produced a few plays. They're not very good. He's produced what we've only come to appreciate now. He wrote a lot of teleplays for RTE in the 60s, which we haven't seen. They're going to be published for the first time next year. But I think his forte is elsewhere. It's in the kind of comic anecdotes of Miles, or it's in the great big set pieces in the novels.
I want to talk to you in a while about the unfinished novel, Slattery's Sago Saga. But on that subject of O'Brien and theatre, that last unfinished novel was, of course, adapted for stage by Arthur Reardon for the Performance Corporation.
Flann O'Brien seems to have this compulsion to continually interrupt himself, whether with footnotes or the plain people of Ireland, or simply write a sentence and then comment on the beauty of it. So it's quite tricky to find an authorial voice, that his whole output is almost a dance around the notion of there being an authorial voice, and so it's more a matter of learning that dance than mimicking one voice. Improbable Frequency was the first place I had Miles as a character in that play, and so had to kind of address the authorial voice. So then I got the offer to adapt Sago Saga.
This was his unfinished novel.
Unfinished, barely started really. I think it amounts to about 37, 38 pages, with one central premise where this very rich American comes to Ireland with the intention of preventing any recurrence of the potato famine, not through any altruistic motives, but simply to stop the dirty Irish from emigrating to America ever again. So that's the central crazy idea, and then there are lots and lots of hints at how the novel might have progressed. There's hints at political skullduggery, there's hints at hidden treasure, and very probably some sort of supernatural element. Now, I had read that the plan was that the story would move to America, and that one of the characters, one or other, and Brian O'Nolan might not even have decided which one himself, was to become an Irish president of America. I kind of felt that going to America would be leaving familiar Miles ground. So what I chose to do instead was to take what was there and treat that as the theme, and my play then would be variations on that theme in the style of Miles. So I took a device which people would recognise from At Swim Two Birds, where various characters suddenly discover that they're fictional and try and wrest control of the plot from each other, heaping injuries and indignities on each other in the process. So yeah, that's and just thought lately that I've given the thing a happy ending, which isn't particularly in the spirit of Miles. He inflicts such casual cruelty on all his protagonists, and they very rarely end up well. The tricky thing was, and especially in something like At Swim Two Birds, there were always layers of narrative, and this works brilliantly on the page, where the story within the story is just as believable as the story within that, and so on. That's a little trickier to put on stage. But on the other hand, you have the advantage of having flesh and blood people discovering that they're fictional characters being played by actors, and that brings its own strange uneasiness, and hopefully it's funny as well. And strange uneasiness is a big thing of Miles. I think the humour is always driven by casual cruelty and a sort of existential dread. I mean, just occurred to me recently that especially The Third Policeman would make a perfect companion piece to Kafka's The Trial. That they're both these horribly paranoid books, and that in The Trial, Joseph K. Is being tried for a crime that he doesn't know what he's committed. And in At Swim Two Birds, the protagonist does know what he's done, but nobody else seems to, but they're tormenting him all the same, which is a nice Irish take on on the idea. But yeah, there is this, that always seems to be the engine behind his humour, this certain horror. Yeah, and I did put an element of the supernatural in Sego Saga as well, where various characters turn out to be leprechauns and selkies. I opted for a leprechaun because it's sort of the least trendy end of Irish mythology, and I thought they deserved a break.
Arthur Reardon there. Keith Hopper, Arthur talked about The Third Policeman, and again references Kafka. That novel unpublished during his lifetime, and it is a remarkable novel.
It's a remarkable novel. I think it's his best work, and I think it gets better with time. It's recently been adapted for the stage, and a steampunk opera of it premiered in London last month. And there's a proposed graphic novel of it in the works. You'll probably know that when it appeared on the American TV show Lost a few years ago, sales of it went through the roof. So more and more people are beginning to discover what was essentially a lost masterpiece. And I think it's interesting to see how people are adapting it now. I think it becomes more relevant with time. There's actually David O'Kane from Strabane has made a 30-minute film where Flann O'Brien, Kafka, and Borges, the great Argentinian writer, are trapped in a room together, a kind of vision of hell, debating their works in their own languages, you know. So I think The Third Policeman kind of inspires and lends itself to different interpretations.
Jenica, Flann O'Brien's star, it would seem, on the rise again. You know, what would you attribute that to? Is it in part the fact that, I suppose, what some people call the Joyce industry is maybe running out of steam and material a little?
Oh, geez, I hope not. I hope that's not the reason for it. But I do think there's a considerable crossover between Joyce and O'Brien, as there would be, and probably as there should be. No, I think what really has happened is that now we're able to understand the novels in a different way, and sort of come to them without being overwhelmed by the myth of Flann O'Brien or Brian O'Nolan and who he was. So when we are able to pick up this book now, we aren't so terribly concerned about reading these books and being thought of as one of the corduroys. I mean, we're able to be a little bit more thick-skinned now and approach it in a way where we can read it with new eyes, with fresh eyes, and see the ways in which he really is still speaking to the reader, even in the 21st century.
You're listening to Arts Tonight. We're looking at